He thought calling her out in front of Harvard's brightest minds would earn him laughter and applause. But Professor Daniel Whitmore had no idea he was about to awaken a legend the university had forgotten. The grand lecture hall of Harvard University shimmered beneath rows of warm brass lights, its polished wood seats filled with graduate students, visiting scholars, and ambitious young minds eager to witness another performance from the man many considered untouchable. Professor Daniel Whitmore stood at the front of the room in a tailored navy suit, silver hair perfectly combed, his posture sharp and practiced like someone who had spent decades commanding silence the moment he entered any room. At 58, he was more than a professor. He was a name in journals, a face on academic panels, and the kind of man who enjoyed reminding others of it. His lectures were famous across campus, not only for brilliance, but for humiliation. Students whispered stories about those who challenged him and left embarrassed before the hour was over. To Daniel, intelligence was not something to share. It was something to weaponize. As the room settled, he adjusted his glasses and wrote a chain of advanced symbols across the board with effortless confidence. Chalk tapped sharply against slate. Every eye followed his hand. Today, he announced, we discuss elegant reasoning, a skill increasingly rare in modern education. A few students laughed softly, already trained to reward his arrogance. Then his eyes drifted toward the middle rows and paused. There she sat, an elderly woman in a faded gray cardigan, hands folded over a small notebook, silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She looked to be in her 70s. No designer bag, no laptop, no university badge hanging from her neck. Just a pair of reading glasses and calm attention. She did not belong in the picture he believed this room should present. Daniel's mouth curved slightly. The room noticed. Students turned one by one to see what had captured his interest. The woman remained still, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned. He continued speaking, but now with a new energy, the kind that appeared whenever he found an easy target. Harvard welcomes lifelong learning, he said, pacing slowly. Though enthusiasm and ability are not always the same thing. More laughter. A young student in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Another glanced back at the older woman, then quickly looked away. She simply kept writing in her notebook with neat, steady strokes. Daniel placed the chalk down and clasped his hands behind his back. Before we continue today's demonstration, I have a small curiosity. His voice carried through the hall like a judge preparing sentence. Ma'am, would you mind standing for us? A hush fell instantly. Heads turned. Pages stopped moving. Even the heating vents seemed quieter. The elderly woman looked up slowly, blinking once as if returning from deep thought. She rose with measured grace, one hand resting lightly on the seat in front of her. Yes? She asked, her tone soft and clear. Daniel smiled the smile students had learned to fear. Wonderful. Perhaps you can help us answer a question about advanced mathematical symmetry. Several students exchanged glances. Someone smirked. Someone else whispered, this is going to be brutal. The woman adjusted her glasses and looked toward the board. Her face revealed nothing. Daniel lifted the chalk once more and wrote a second line of symbols beneath the first, more complex, more layered, the kind of problem designed less to teach than to intimidate. He turned back to her, savoring the moment. Please, he said, gesturing toward the front of the hall. Come show us what you know. The room went completely silent. Daniel Whitmore stepped aside with theatrical courtesy, one hand extended toward the aisle as if inviting entertainment rather than inquiry. The elderly woman closed her notebook carefully, placed the pencil inside its spine, and began walking toward the front of the hall. Her steps were slow but steady, the measured pace of someone who had long ago learned that rushing impresses only the insecure. The hardwood floor echoed beneath sensible shoes polished by years of use. Students leaned into one another, whispering predictions. Some expected confusion. Others expected embarrassment. A few simply looked away, uncomfortable with what they knew was coming. Daniel watched her approach with the satisfaction of a man who believed every second belonged to him. Please be careful on the steps, he said loudly enough for the room to hear. We would hate for today's lesson to become medical. Laughter burst from several corners of the hall, sharp and eager. A young man in the back laughed hardest, then quickly stopped when no one joined him a second time. The woman reached the board and turned calmly toward the audience. Up close, her cardigan was clean though worn at the cuffs. Her face, carried fine lines that suggested decades of thought rather than worry. Her eyes, behind simple glasses, were clear and unusually alert. Daniel handed her the chalk between two fingers, as if passing a test she was certain to fail. "The problem is straightforward for those prepared," he said. "Take all the time you need." Again, scattered laughter. She accepted the chalk with a small nod. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was gentle, but it carried with surprising ease. Then she turned to the board and studied the equations in silence. 10 seconds passed. 15. Daniel folded his arms. A student checked his phone. Another stifled a grin. The room settled into that cruel anticipation unique to public embarrassment. Then the woman lifted the chalk and drew a single diagonal line through the second expression. Gasps rose instantly. Daniel straightened. "Excuse me," he said. Without turning around, she spoke softly. "This term invalidates the symmetry you are claiming." The chalk moved again, quick now, certain, rewriting 3 symbols and shifting a variable to the left side of the board. Her hand did not tremble. "You introduced an assumption here," she continued, tapping the original line, "but never proved continuity under transformation." Several students blinked, then opened laptops. Pages flipped. Daniel's expression tightened. "That is not the assigned task," he snapped. She turned halfway toward him, still calm. "No, Professor, but it is the necessary one." A hush fell heavier than before. Even those who understood little mathematics recognized authority when they heard it. She resumed writing. Symbols flowed across the board in a clean, elegant sequence unlike the dense clutter Daniel had produced. Where his work sprawled, hers distilled. Where his argued, hers resolved. Ryan Cole, the department's top doctoral candidate, sat bolt upright. His eyes moved rapidly from board to notes to board again. "That cannot be right," whispered someone near him. Ryan swallowed hard. "It is," he said. The words spread in ripples through the rows. Daniel stepped forward, then stopped. He scanned each line, searching for error, for hesitation, for anything to restore the script he had written in his head. There was none. The woman placed the chalk on the tray with care. "If your goal was elegance," she said, facing the room at last, "it usually begins by removing what is unnecessary." No one laughed. No one moved. A student in the front row slowly closed his mouth. Daniel's smile had vanished so completely it seemed never to have existed. Then from the third row, Dr. Melissa Grant rose to her feet, staring at the board as though she had seen a ghost. Dr. Melissa Grant remained standing long after everyone else had frozen in their seats. Her hand rested against the desk in front of her as she stared at the board, eyes moving across the elegant chain of symbols with the disbelief of someone recognizing a voice from decades ago. "That structure," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It cannot be." Daniel Whitmore recovered first, though only partially. He straightened his jacket, cleared his throat, and forced a thin smile back onto his face. "Well," he said, voice tighter than before, "an interesting amateur variation. Mathematics often attracts hobbyists." No one laughed this time. The silence that followed was colder than mockery. Melissa turned toward him sharply. "Amateur," she said. "Do you have any idea what you are looking at?" Daniel's jaw set. "I am looking at an unconventional shortcut." "No," she replied, stepping into the aisle. "You are looking at the Carter reduction." A wave of confusion passed through the room. Students glanced at one another, searching memory and notes. Ryan Cole nearly dropped his pen. "The Carter reduction?" he repeated under his breath. Melissa nodded without taking her eyes off the board. "Published anonymously in a private research archive 31 years ago. 3 pages that changed modern symmetry theory." Several laptops opened at once. Fingers flew across keyboards. Search results populated. Academic databases refreshed. Daniel's face lost color by degrees. "That paper was never verified," he said quickly. "Its author was unknown." "Its author was brilliant," Melissa answered. "And every major department in the country has cited those methods since." She turned slowly toward the woman in the gray cardigan. "Only one person solved a transformation paradox this way. Only one person preferred clarity over spectacle." The elderly woman said nothing. She simply adjusted her glasses and looked toward the students, now staring at her with something far different from amusement. Respect had entered the room quietly. Ryan stood halfway from his seat, eyes wide. "Professor Grant," he said, voice shaking, "if this is who you think it is, Melissa gave a small, almost reverent smile. Then all of us should be standing. Chairs scraped across polished wood. One by one. Then row by row, students rose to their feet. Daniel remained motionless at the front, trapped between outrage and realization. "This is absurd," he said. "You are making assumptions based on style." The woman finally looked at him directly. There was no anger in her expression, only patience sharpened by experience. "Style reveals habits," she said softly. "Habits reveal thought." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Melissa approached the front row and lifted an old leather satchel from beside her chair. From it, she removed a worn journal bound in dark cloth. "I brought this today for archival donation," she said. "Notes from a symposium in Zurich, 1995. She opened to a yellowed page and held it high. There, sketched in fading ink, was the exact same sequence now written on Harvard's board. At the bottom of the page, a name had been underlined twice. Evelyn Carter. The room inhaled as one. Students leaned forward as if witnessing history made flesh. Ryan whispered the name again. Slower this time, like something sacred. Daniel stared at the page, then at the woman, then back at the board where his own work now looked cluttered and small. "You disappeared," Melissa said to Evelyn, her voice gentler now. "Departments searched for years. Offers came from everywhere." Evelyn folded her hands loosely in front of her. "Some doors open only after you stop knocking," she said. "And some lives matter more than titles." A young woman in the second row wiped tears from her eyes without understanding exactly why. Perhaps because greatness had entered dressed in humility. Perhaps because arrogance had finally met a mirror. Daniel took one step backward. For the first time in many years, the most powerful man in the room was not the one holding the podium. No one sat down after that. The lecture hall remained standing in a stunned hush, as if movement itself might break the fragile moment now hanging in the air. Evelyn Carter stood beside the board with the calm posture of someone who had never needed an audience to know her worth. Daniel Whitmore, by contrast, looked like a man searching for solid ground where none remained. His eyes drifted across the room, hoping for support from students who had once laughed on cue. He found only silence. Melissa Grant closed the old journal and stepped toward the stage. 30 years ago, she said, her voice carrying with practiced authority, departments across the country debated who wrote those papers. Princeton claimed the author was one of theirs. Stanford said it had to be a committee. Cambridge insisted no single mind could have done it alone. She turned to Evelyn with visible admiration. "And all that time, you said nothing." Evelyn gave the smallest smile. "I was busy raising 2 sons and paying a mortgage." Soft laughter moved through the room, warm this time, human and relieved. Ryan Cole stepped closer to the board, eyes fixed on the equations. "Professor Carter," he said before catching himself. "I mean, Ms. Carter, why disappear?" She looked at him kindly. "Because recognition can become another form of noise," she said. "And noise makes it hard to think." Several students wrote that sentence down immediately. Daniel finally found his voice. "If you were truly who they claim," he said, each word carefully chosen, "why never teach at a major institution? Why hide in obscurity?" It was the question of a man who still believed prestige was proof. Evelyn turned toward him fully now. "I did teach," she answered. "Night classes at a community center in Ohio. $10 per student. Free if they brought curiosity." A ripple passed through the room stronger than applause. Melissa laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like you." Daniel's shoulders tightened. "This room is built on standards," he said. "Credentials matter." "They do," Evelyn replied. "But credentials are records of past approval. They are not guarantees of present wisdom." The room went still again. Even those who had admired Daniel for years now looked at him differently, as if expensive framing had finally fallen off a mediocre painting. Ryan raised his hand instinctively, then lowered it, embarrassed by habit. Evelyn noticed and nodded. "Go ahead." "Is it true," he asked, "that the Carter reduction was only part of a larger theory?" A spark appeared in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "but I never finished writing it." "Why not?" asked another student from the back. Evelyn glanced toward the high windows where late afternoon light had turned gold. "Life interrupted. It often does. Your father gets sick. Your children need shoes. Your husband loses work. The roof leaks. Great ideas wait while real things demand attention." More than one student lowered their gaze. Many had never heard brilliance described beside groceries and bills. Melissa faced the audience. Do you understand what this means? You are in the presence of one of the finest mathematical minds of the last half-century. This time the applause came suddenly and all at once, filling the wood-paneled hall with thunder. Students who had mocked her minutes earlier clapped hardest, hoping noise might erase memory. Evelyn accepted none of it as triumph. She simply stood there, hands folded, patient as ever. Daniel did not clap. His eyes were fixed on the board where her clean proof remained above the remains of his own crowded lecture. Notes. At last he spoke, quieter now. I may have misjudged you. Evelyn met his gaze without cruelty. No, she said. You judged yourself through me. The applause stopped as quickly as it began. Some lessons arrived louder in silence. Daniel looked down at the chalk dust on his hands as if seeing it for the first time. The room had once belonged to him. Now it belonged to truth. The applause faded slowly, like thunder rolling beyond distant hills, leaving behind something rarer than noise. Reflection. Students remained standing, uncertain whether they were witnessing the end of a lecture or the beginning of one. Evelyn Carter glanced toward the clock above the rear doors and smiled faintly. I promised my grandson I would be home by 6, she said. So if anyone has a useful question, now would be a good time. Laughter rose again, but this time it was affectionate. Hands shot up across the hall. The same students who had sat silent under Daniel Whitmore's authority now leaned forward with eager humility. Ryan Cole spoke first. How do you know when an elegant proof is complete? Evelyn picked up the chalk once more. When removing one more step would make it dishonest, she said. She wrote a short expression beneath her earlier work, then underlined it once. Beauty in mathematics is not decoration. It is truth without waste. Pens moved furiously. Screens glowed. Minds opened. Another student asked how she trained herself without elite mentorship. I read library books past midnight, she answered. I made mistakes in pencil and corrections in ink. I learned that confusion is not failure. It is tuition. A murmur of appreciation spread through the room. Melissa Grant stood to the side, smiling like someone watching justice arrive right on time. Daniel remained near the podium, hands clasped, posture stiff. Every few moments he looked as if he might speak, then thought better of it. For years he had controlled this room by having all the answers. Today he had discovered the weakness of that strategy. It leaves no room for learning. A young woman in the front row raised her hand timidly. Did people underestimate you often? Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Often enough to become useful, she said. When people assume little of you, they stop guarding doors. The student nodded slowly, as if receiving permission she had needed for years. Ryan glanced toward Daniel, then back to Evelyn. What should scholars fear most? He asked. The room grew quiet. Evelyn set the chalk down carefully. Certainty, she said, especially the kind that needs an audience. Several heads turned toward Daniel before quickly facing forward again. He felt it. Everyone did. Yet Evelyn's tone held no cruelty. She was not punishing him. She was diagnosing a disease larger than one man. The lecture hall doors opened softly, and 2 late faculty members slipped in, confused by the standing crowd and charged silence. One saw the board and froze. The other recognized Evelyn instantly, placing a hand over his heart. Word had begun spreading through campus faster than any official announcement. Legends travel quickly when proven alive. Melissa approached Daniel at last. You could still do something rare today, she said quietly enough that only those nearest heard. You could be teachable. Daniel stared at the floor, then at the chalkboard, then finally at Evelyn. Pride fought visibly with wisdom. Pride had been winning for decades. At last he stepped forward. Miss Carter, he said, voice lower than anyone had ever heard from him. I owe you an apology. No cameras flashed. No music swelled. Yet the room felt the weight of it. Evelyn regarded him with calm eyes. Then give it to the next person you are tempted to belittle, she replied. I have no use for delayed manners. A stunned beat passed, followed by quiet laughter, and then applause softer than before, but deeper. Daniel nodded once. For the first time, he looked smaller and somehow more human. Evelyn gathered her notebook and slipped the pencil inside. Thank you for the questions, she said. Keep your curiosity sharper than your ego. As she walked toward the aisle, students moved aside instinctively, creating a clear path through the rows. No one had been told to stand. No one had been instructed to make room. Respect had organized them better than authority ever could. The hallway outside the lecture hall had never seemed so narrow. Students poured through the doors in a rush of whispers, hurried footsteps, and wide-eyed disbelief. Yet all movement slowed whenever Evelyn Carter appeared in view. She walked calmly through the marble corridor with her notebook tucked beneath one arm, as though she had merely attended an ordinary afternoon class. Behind her, professors who once would have passed without notice now stood aside and offered respectful nods. Some introduced themselves too late. Others simply watched in humbled silence. Ryan Cole caught up near the staircase, nearly out of breath. "Miss Carter," he said, "would you consider meeting with our doctoral group sometime? Even 1 hour would mean everything." Evelyn glanced at him kindly. "1 hour only means something if you arrive prepared," she said. "Send me your hardest question first. If it is sincere, I will come." Ryan smiled like a man handed treasure. "I will." Melissa Grant joined them moments later, carrying the old journal against her chest. "Campus administration is already asking if you would accept an honorary chair," she said with amused disbelief. It took them 12 minutes. Evelyn let out a soft laugh. 12 minutes is efficient for committees. Melissa shook her head. "You know what I mean. They want their names near yours now." "Then they still misunderstand names," Evelyn replied. At the far end of the corridor, Daniel Whitmore emerged slowly from the lecture hall alone. The crowd parted instinctively, not from admiration this time, but uncertainty. He no longer moved like the center of the building. He moved like a man hearing his own footsteps for the first time. When he reached them, he stopped several feet away. "Miss Carter," he said, voice measured, "I would like to ask something privately, if you permit it." Evelyn studied him, then nodded toward a quiet alcove lined with portraits of past faculty. They stepped aside while students pretended not to listen. Daniel clasped his hands. "When did I become that man?" he asked. It was not a polished question. It was honest, and honesty looked unfamiliar on him. Evelyn glanced at the portraits on the wall, rows of stern faces framed in gold. Slowly, she said, "That is how most character is built and how most character is lost." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I began wanting excellence." "Many do," she answered. "Then praise enters the room and never leaves." He exhaled sharply, as if struck by nothing more than truth. "Can it be undone?" She considered him for a moment. "Only if you choose curiosity over performance every day. Pride is loud, but habit is louder." Daniel nodded once. There were no dramatic tears, no grand collapse. Only a quiet man receiving the first useful advice he had heard in years. Melissa approached the alcove. "Your ride is here," she told Evelyn. Through the front windows, a modest silver sedan waited at the curb. Not a limousine, not a chauffeured town car. Just an older vehicle with clean seats and a patient driver. Daniel looked surprised despite himself. Evelyn noticed. "My grandson drives for a delivery company," she said. "He borrows this on Tuesdays." Daniel almost smiled. "Of course he does." She extended her hand. After a brief hesitation, he shook it. "Thank you for correcting more than my equations," he said. "Do not thank me yet," she replied. "Thank me when your students feel smaller fears and larger possibilities." The handshake ended. So did something else that had ruled the hall for years. As Evelyn walked toward the exit, students lining the corridor began applauding again, softer now, respectful and unprompted. She acknowledged them with a nod, but did not slow her pace. Outside, late sunlight spilled across the stone steps in long golden bands. She descended carefully, entered the waiting sedan, and closed the door. The car pulled away without ceremony. Inside the building, portraits remained fixed on the walls. But everyone knew the most important lesson taught there that day would never need a frame. By the next morning, Harvard had changed in ways no official memo could explain. The campus still wore its old brick dignity. The bells still marked the hour, and students still hurried through courtyards balancing coffee cups and deadlines. Yet something invisible had shifted. Conversations in hallways were quieter. Questions in classrooms were bolder, and for the first time in years, many students seemed less interested in sounding intelligent than becoming so. Clips from the lecture had spread across private student networks overnight. Not the whole event, only fragments. A silver-haired woman correcting a world-famous professor with calm precision. The stunned silence after her final line. The moment an auditorium stood without being told. Some called it legendary. Others called it overdue. Ryan Cole arrived early to Daniel Whitmore's morning seminar, expecting cancellation. Instead, he found the professor already there, alone in the front row rather than behind the podium. Daniel wore no suit jacket, only a plain white shirt with sleeves rolled neatly to the forearm. The chalkboard behind him had been erased completely. Even the faint dust outlines were gone. Students entered cautiously, sensing unfamiliar weather. Daniel looked up as they took their seats. "Good morning," he said. The phrase sounded simple, but several students exchanged surprised glances. He had rarely used it before. He stood, then paused as if abandoning a script mid-sentence. "Yesterday," he began, "many of you witnessed something valuable. I did as well." No one moved. Pens hovered. "I have mistaken intimidation for rigor," he continued, "and performance for teaching." The room remained still, not out of fear now, but attention. Daniel inhaled once. "That ends today." A student in the back nearly dropped his notebook. Ryan leaned forward. Daniel turned to the board and wrote only 3 words in clear block letters. "Ask better questions." Then he stepped aside. "For the next hour," he said, "you will challenge every assumption in last week's proofs, including mine." Murmurs swept the room. This was not how his classes worked. They had always moved one direction, downward from authority. A young woman raised her hand cautiously. "Professor, what if we think your theorem on recursive limits was incomplete?" Daniel nodded. "Then I hope you can defend that thought." She blinked, then smiled slowly. Another hand rose. Then another. Within minutes the room was alive with real debate, awkward at first, then energized. Students interrupted one another respectfully. They questioned notation, hidden premises, weak transitions. Daniel answered some, conceded others, and when he did not know, he simply said, "I do not know." Each time he said it, the class trusted him more. Ryan watched in disbelief. Pride had once filled every inch of this room. Now space existed for learning. Across campus, Melissa Grant sat with the dean, declining 3 separate proposals to turn the previous day into a publicity campaign. "If you brand humility," she told them dryly, "you have missed the lesson." The dean removed his glasses and sighed. "Can we at least invite Ms. Carter to speak formally?" Melissa smiled. "Invite her, yes. Expect her, no." Meanwhile, in a modest suburb 40 minutes away, Evelyn Carter sat at a kitchen table covered with grocery coupons, mail, and a stack of handwritten notes Ryan had delivered at dawn through overnight courier. Her grandson, Marcus, poured coffee and shook his head. "Grandma, the internet thinks you are a secret genius." Evelyn looked over the rim of her mug. "The internet is late." Marcus laughed so hard he nearly spilled the cream. She opened Ryan's envelope and found one question written carefully across the top page. "How do I become great without becoming proud?" Evelyn's expression softened. She reached for a pencil. Outside, morning light touched the window pane. Somewhere at Harvard, a professor was learning to listen. Somewhere else, a student was learning what to ask. And in a quiet kitchen, the sharpest mind in the story began writing back. 3 days later, the line outside Emerson Hall formed before sunrise. Students wrapped in coats stood with notebooks pressed to their chests, trading rumors in the cold morning air. Some said she had accepted Harvard's invitation. Others said she had refused 3 times and only agreed after Ryan Cole mailed handwritten questions instead of formal requests. By 8 o'clock, every seat inside the lecture hall was taken. By 8:15, students were sitting on steps, leaning against walls, even standing in the back beside maintenance carts and folded chairs. No banners hung from the stage. No. Television cameras waited in the aisles. The university had wanted ceremony. Evelyn Carter had requested only a chalkboard, 2 pieces of chalk, and a pitcher of water. Daniel Whitmore stood near the side entrance greeting students as they entered. He shook hands, helped an elderly visitor find a seat, and directed late arrivals toward overflow rooms. More than one student stared in disbelief. A week earlier, he would have considered such tasks beneath him. Now he performed them quietly, almost gratefully. Melissa Grant approached and handed him a folded note. "From Evelyn," she said. Daniel opened it. In careful handwriting were 7 words. "Chairs do not make a teacher." He smiled despite himself and tucked the note into his pocket. At exactly 9 o'clock, the side door opened. Evelyn entered wearing the same gray cardigan, carrying the same notebook, and the room rose instantly. The standing ovation lasted nearly a minute. She waited patiently until the applause softened on its own, then lifted one hand. Silence followed faster than any microphone could command. "Please sit," she said, standing his heart on the knees. Laughter rolled warmly through the hall. She walked to the board, set down her notebook, and looked across the packed room. "I was asked to give a lecture," she began. "But lectures are often what people call it when one person speaks too long." More laughter. Even Daniel lowered his head with a rueful smile. "So instead," she continued, "today we will think together." She wrote a single question on the board in large, neat letters. "What is intelligence for?" Students stared. Some expected formulas. Others expected history. Instead, they received something harder. Hands rose immediately. "Discovery," said one student. "Innovation," said another. "Career success," offered someone in the back, drawing chuckles. Evelyn nodded at each answer without praise or dismissal. Then she pointed to a young woman near the front. "To help people solve problems," the student said quietly. Evelyn smiled. "Closer." She turned and wrote beneath the question, "To reduce unnecessary suffering." The room became still. "If intelligence only increases status," she said, "it is decoration. If it only wins arguments, it is theater. If it only praises itself, it becomes foolishness wearing expensive shoes." Several heads turned unconsciously toward Daniel. He did not flinch this time. He simply listened. Ryan Cole raised his hand. "Then what is brilliance?" he asked. Evelyn uncapped the water pitcher, poured a small glass, and answered after a thoughtful sip. "Brilliance is useful clarity delivered with humility." Pens moved instantly. Phones recorded openly now, but no one seemed distracted. Even screens appeared attentive. For the next hour, she moved through stories rather than equations. She spoke of factory workers who optimized machines without degrees, mothers who balanced impossible budgets with elegant logic, janitors who noticed patterns professors missed, children who asked better questions than experts. Each example landed with quiet force. Near the end, she invited Daniel to the board. A ripple moved through the crowd. He approached without hesitation. She handed him the chalk. "Professor," she said, "please erase one mistake from last week." He looked at the board, then wrote a single word beneath her sentence on intelligence. "Ego." The room went silent, then broke into applause deeper than before. Evelyn nodded once. "Now class may begin." The story might have ended there for most universities, with applause, headlines, and a framed photograph placed somewhere near a donor plaque. But real change rarely arrives with trumpets. It arrives in habits. In the weeks that followed, classrooms across campus began to feel different. Professors who once prized intimidation found students less willing to confuse fear with respect. Office doors opened more often. Questions were met with patience instead of performance. Even the language of the place softened. Students stopped saying "crush the competition" and started saying "understand the problem." No policy announced it. No committee measured it. Yet everyone noticed. Daniel Whitmore noticed most of all. He removed the oversized portrait of himself from his office wall and replaced it with a blank corkboard where students could pin unsolved questions. He shortened his lectures and lengthened discussions. He returned marked papers with comments that challenged rather than belittled. When students thanked him for changing, he answered honestly, "I am practicing." Ryan Cole became the first doctoral candidate in years to invite undergraduates into his research meetings. "Good ideas do not care about rank," he told them, repeating words he wished he had heard sooner. Melissa Grant declined 3 television interviews and instead organized free Saturday workshops for public school teachers, naming them the Carter Sessions despite Evelyn's objections. "If you use my name," Evelyn told her over the phone, "make sure coffee is included." It was. As for Evelyn, she returned to her ordinary life with remarkable speed. She shopped for groceries on Wednesdays, attended her grandson Marcus's softball games on Sundays, and continued tutoring neighborhood kids at the public library every Thursday evening for the price of one sincere effort. Children who had struggled with fractions now solved puzzles for fun. Parents brought pies and casseroles in gratitude. She accepted none of the praise for long. "Bring sharpened pencils next week," she would say. Harvard sent letters, honorary titles, invitations to gala dinners, and offers of endowed chairs. She answered most with handwritten notes no longer than 3 sentences. "Thank you kindly. Please give the money to scholarships. I already have a chair." The line became famous across campus. One crisp October afternoon, Daniel drove 40 miles to the suburb where she lived. He carried no camera crew, no flowers, no speech. Only a folder of revised course plans and a small apple pie from a bakery recommended by Melissa. Marcus opened the door and grinned. "You are the professor who got corrected." Daniel smiled with humility hard-earned. "That is one way to say it." Evelyn invited him in. They sat at a modest kitchen table while rain tapped gently against the window. Daniel spread out his lesson plans. "Would you review these?" he asked. "I want to teach rigor without cruelty." She adjusted her glasses and began reading. For 2 hours she crossed out vanity, circled clarity, and wrote notes in the margins with precise blue ink. At last she slid the pages back. "Better," she said. "Still too many words on page 3. Daniel laughed, a sound freer than any he had made in years. Before leaving, he hesitated at the doorway. "Why did you come that first day?" he asked. Evelyn looked past him toward the wet street